everybody, and welcome to another episode of Clean Techies. As always, sponsored and made possible by Next Wave Partners. In today's episode, I had the privilege of speaking with Apoorv Sinha of Carbon Upcycling Technologies. He's the CEO and one of the founders of this business. And what they're doing in carbon tech is quite incredible. They've been able to come up with some incredible innovations, taking things all the way from the technology creation itself with just an idea and proving its ability to work, as well as the ability to monetize it in the future, into creating products that are actually good for the economy. So really great conversation today. I really hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did creating this podcast. And again, please let me know your thoughts at the end and enjoy the show. Very good. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Apoorv. I appreciate you taking the time. For everybody listening, I guess, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit? Obviously, you've given a bit of an intro prior to this starting, but we'd love to hear from you, kind of your background and your story and what you're doing with carbon upcycling technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Silas, for having me here. My name is Apoorv Sinha. I serve as the CEO of Carbon Upcycling. We're a Calgary-based Canadian carbon utilization company. And over the last 6 years, we've been working on a technology to mineralize carbon emissions into solid products. And primarily, we've been focusing on some high-volume industries such as construction, plastics. We've started to do some other work in areas like energy storage and pharmaceuticals as well. But the whole notion behind carbon upcycling has been on how do we take humanity's most abundant pollutant, carbon emissions, CO2, and convert that into a valuable product. We think that that would be the most impactful circular economy argument. And we also think that overall that has a very immediate economic opportunity, which hopefully with time will only get bigger. So we'll see how this goes.
For sure. And so how did you end up getting onto this path? Because I think if I remember correctly, you had done another startup prior to this, which was regarding water, if I remember correctly.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So back during my undergrad years, I did my undergrad down in Atlanta. I was at Georgia Tech. And with a buddy of mine, we started a humanitarian logistics company that was primarily looking at getting water out to areas that have been struck by a natural disaster without having to get provisions like, heavy major construction equipment to site to run, to reestablish like trading routes or roads and things like that. The intent was essentially to take a technology from the oil field service sector, coil tubing, where they basically take this long string of tubing, thousands and thousands of feet long. They spool it, and then they unspool it to get down to very deep wells. So they're doing that for subsurface work. My idea with Ben was to look at unspooling this on the ground so that if you've got a broken bridge or a landslide that's made a road unusable, you can kind of drag this spool out, unspool this tubing, and get water or some kind of supplies over 1,000 or 100 or 1,000 kilometers. And what we found there was, although we thought that the technical innovation was unique, you were taking kind of something that works that has worked in another sector over to something else. That part of it felt really novel, and both of us were engineers, so we kind of got a nerd high from that. But what we realized was that the primary reason for why innovation in humanitarian logistics tend to be slow and frankly just not very effective is because you need a lot of social and behavioral change to happen on the ground. And so it's not just a matter of a technical innovation. You give them a new gadget, it works great, and everyone uses it. It's not very much like the tech crowd in that instance. You're dealing with people that have been doing things a certain way. A lot of these people come from an NGO background, or even from a policy or kind of a government bureaucrat background, and nothing wrong with that, except that when you go with adopting new innovation, that isn't the early adopter crowd that you hear about, right? And so I think overall, to get to your question, I did that full time for about 2 years, and basically just got disillusioned. I've always been an advocate, I guess, for the lean startup methodology, and Eric Ries and Steve Blank talk about the product market fit and going out and talking to a lot of customers. And I think what we're finding was it was always a challenge to convince the customer that they wanted what we wanted, that we wanted to sell them. And so it was almost like you're pushing too much, and there wasn't really much of market pull with that work. Although we had a couple of projects that we still remain pretty proud of. ultimately it didn't create the kind of impact or kind of the foundation that we thought would lead to impact over a period of time. And so, yeah, I think from my standpoint, I started looking at other things. And in 2013, there was a provincial agency here in Alberta, in the province of Canada that we live in, and they had what they called a Grand Challenge. It was kind of a precursor to the Carbon X Prize, not the one that Elon Musk has just talked about, but the
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
preceding, right? Which is around carbon use and trying to find useful ways of converting carbon into a useful resource. And so they came up with this call, and I got intrigued by it, put an application together, and as luck would have it, we ended up getting $500,000 in seed money to kind of move that idea along. And 6.5 years later, that's become, the company that we call Carbon Upcycling. And I still have a job kind of leading our charge there. So, if you told me back in 2014 that I'd still be on this and that it would have grown to as many different kind of facets and market angles as it has, I would have, bit your hand off. Like it's actually pretty remarkable that we've been able to create traction and technical validation at the various levels that
Mhm.
we have. But primarily, I think from an intrinsic standpoint, what I found really enjoyable about this journey is, you know, um, you learn a lot in school, obviously. Like I went to school for chemical engineering, and you learn a lot of basics around heat transfer and thermodynamics and kinetics and things like that if you're doing chemical work. Um, but it really never sinks in till you're actually working on it and trying to figure out what the real life implications of it are. And I think the learnings that you get on the field, or like actually trying to move an entrepreneurial endeavor forward, in my opinion, there's no substitute for that type of learning. You're so invested in it. You have to learn pretty much every single piece of it to feel comfortable and to feel that you've really understood the story. And then to have the challenge of not only understanding that, but then to be able to share that with other stakeholders, whether they be investors or users you're trying to convince, is another kind of exciting challenge. Like there's that whole saying of, like, if you really know something well, teach it to someone and see how well you teach it. And I think, without sounding, like an entrepreneur is ever teaching anyone anything, like I think there is the challenge of kind of at least telling people your story. And yeah, I think overall it's just been an exciting journey, and I'm really glad that I've become involved in this space.
Yeah. So one thing I'm a little bit curious about is, you've been doing this since 2013 is when this kind of came around, right? So what have the different kind of phases looked like, especially with creating a new technology and, like you said, technically validating it? What does it look like? Because I feel like there's so many clean tech sectors that are going to go through the same process. Could you speak to that a little bit and maybe just some advice for people who are about to go through this with their own technologies?
Yeah, it's a very broad question. So first off, I'll just add the caveat that although kind of that initial paperwork for that challenge started in 2013, we didn't actually do any real work on this. I actually still had a full-time job at this small oil field service company as like an R&D manager. I actually kept holding on to that job for the first 2 years while I
Okay.
served as CEO for Carbon Upcycling. And so it didn't really become a full-time endeavor, frankly, till probably, I'd say, early 2016. Um, but in that time, I think to answer kind of your more thematic question about the phases that a startup goes through, I think a technical startup is unique because you're not only looking at the product market fit, but you're also simultaneously solving the problem of like, what product can I actually make, right? So the minimum viable product isn't just what's the basic minimum thing that a customer is going to pay you for. It's also like, do you actually have the ability to make that product in the first place? And we always kind of talk about kind of the lean startup methodology within the technology context. But if you think about it, like a lot of the work that companies like Amazon, Facebook, Stripe, and others have done, they've been built on technologies that have actually been proven for a long period of time. Like none of them have to worry about a server not working
Hmm.
because it's not a new technology. Like the servers that come out to market have been working for a period of time. The internet works, your laptops and other systems work. And so the I guess the intent in kind of sharing that is that when you're talking about a hardware technology, a clean technology, that isn't a given. A lot of the work that we do is still fundamental science. And in our case, when we initially received the money, it was in March 2014 when we finally received notification that we have some money to play with. And it took us till probably August before we could come up with a baseline design of experiments. And it wasn't until October of that year that we finally started doing those experiments. And so the very first kind of stage that we went through, and I think this is kind of consistent across the board, is you need to show that the technology itself has some merit. So, for us, that meant two things. One, does the technology actually capture carbon emissions? Because that was one of the main claims we had made.
Yeah.
That was what the grant people wanted to see, and that's what we wanted to see, right? Like, is this a carbon embedded product? And luckily, like within a month and a half of doing our first set of runs, like we were repeatedly showing that you are sequestering CO2 in this end product. The second piece was, does anyone want to pay you for what you're coming out with, or is this just dirt, right? Like, is this just rock you take from a beach, you mineralize CO2 into it, and you put it back on the beach and forget about it? And unfortunately, as you can imagine, like there isn't, a ubiquitous carbon tax around the world, and even in places where there is a carbon tax, it's not enough to make the economics work. Like everything costs money. Like, if you're going to send a dozer out or a loader out to the beach to collect all these rocks that can capture CO2 and then run it through this process, all of that's going to take money. A $20 carbon tax isn't going to pay for any of that. And so our notion from the onset was to make sure that the second piece also worked. Like we wanted the end product with the CO2 to have some sort of value for society and for a certain market sector where we could make an economic value proposition. And frankly, the first half only took us 2 to 4 months to figure out. The next half took us 3 years. We had to talk to construction companies. We had to talk to, I would say, almost a dozen. I think we had 11 agreements with different research groups across North America. We had a couple in Europe and in Australia as well. But primarily, our interest was to look at how do we make sure that there is a technical value proposition in each of these market segments, whether it be adhesives, batteries, construction materials like cement and concrete, plastics, different type of polymers that are used in consumer electronics or in plastic packaging, biodegradable polymers. And those are all kind of efforts that are still going in one way or another. But what has been gratifying is that at least in 2 or 3 of those areas, we've been able to show some real traction, which if there wasn't any, we would have been able to cut that cord off within 6 to 9 months. Like, so, there was some initial kind of ray of hope, if you want to call it, or like some reason to believe that there is something novel here that has kept us going 5 years later. And I think, one of the good things about doing R&D from a startup standpoint is there is almost no inefficiency there. We're not a big, large, Ivy League school, for example, that's just going to spend money on lithium sulfur batteries, even though they're never going to take off because it just makes sense. We've got a couple of professors on tenure. We have to keep them fed, right? Like there's nothing like that. Like in a startup, I think the pledge that the founders made at Carbon Upcycling, which I still think was a very kind of admirable thing that I'd like to repeat in the future, is we said that we're only going to follow evidence-based kind of rationale here. So, if we had found within the first year that our material was going into concrete and making it worse, and it was going into plastics and making it worse, and everything we tried, like it just made it crappier, I think, we had made the pledge that we would basically stop the experiment. We'd not seek any additional funding and things like that. But fortunately, that initial blind faith to a certain extent, because the technology was combining a couple of elements that were fairly novel, it kind of helped us evolve through those phases to a point now, like, so initially it was like the technical validation, then like the product market technical fit. And now we're in this stage, which is to me the most kind of encompassing and engrossing, because you can never switch off once you start talking to customers about prices and deals. But it's also the most challenging because, me coming from a technical background, like I've had to kind of learn all of that kind of on the go. Like there hasn't been a lot of training that I did through a business school or anything. And frankly, I'm not sure how much that would have prepared me, given, all the different facets of things you have to look at. But what's been exciting now, like in this third stage of evolution, it's all about convincing someone to take the jump and say, look, for years, year upon year, like for 2 to 3 years now, especially in the construction space, we've consistently shown what our value prop can be. We're showing that the technology has economic merit, like it can actually save people money. And so now it's a matter of convincing these people to take some bigger bets. And, that takes a lot of negotiating. It takes a lot of staying power as a startup. Like, you have runways of usually 12 to 18 months, but now you've got to kind of look at, dealing with a company that makes decisions on a 3-year time frame, and make sure you're alive by the time they sign on the contract. So there are a whole set of different challenges that come with it. But I think to your point about what advice I would give to other entrepreneurs kind of getting into this journey, I would just say that sticking to first principles is the most important thing. And I think a couple of them that really stick with me, I would say maybe 3 of them. So one is that if you're a technology company, the technology has to be good. There are some companies, even in our space, where the technology is frankly quite dubious. Like it's in this gray area of it, like it sounds good, but it doesn't really do what it's supposed to. To me, as a technical founder, I would strongly urge any startup founder to really pay, hard attention and take a hard look at, does your technology actually move the needle? It doesn't have to be disruptive. It can be incremental, but it genuinely has to be incremental, and the case absolutely has to make sense. Because if it's on, shaky science, you might get a few good years. You might get a really good, ex McKinsey guy like doing your pitches and doing well, and that's great. But at some point, the technology is going to have to speak for itself, and you have to be really good at doing that. The second piece I would say is the product market fit. I think you have to talk to your customers as early as you can. And I think even though it took us 3 years to get that market validation and engaging with the larger customers, one of the things I look back at is like within the first 6 months of getting our first set of results in 2014, we were already talking to a few customers. We're in a smaller kind of city, even by Canadian standards. We're not in a Vancouver or Toronto. But I know for a fact that we could have probably been even faster. And if I was to do another startup, I'd be talking to the customers before I even did my first experiment, to be honest with you. So, trying to establish that market fit would be the second lesson. And I think the third one would just be, being conscious of the importance of having money. Like, even more so since COVID, obviously, like there have been some incredible measures by governments all across the world now to keep companies afloat, to keep people, afloat with their personal finances. And a lot of that has been driven well. And I think a lot of that money probably hasn't been spent very well. But as a startup, I think what you have to be careful about is you only can stay like in business as long as you're able to pay your bills. And so to be able to be very conscious about how you spend your money, even if you're great at raising money and getting a lot of funding to make sure that you can expand your runway and hire a lot, I'm definitely of kind of the old school kind of way of thinking about running a startup. And I think, making sure that you can live within your means. It's interesting. I actually attended the Masters of Scale kind of Harvard Business School course that Reid Hoffman and a few other HBS professors ran in 2019. And, it was an insightful course. Like they had 6 different professors all talking about case studies of companies that absolutely ramped up and they followed that blitzkrieg method of scaling, blitz scaling, as Reid Hoffman calls it. I'm still pretty, reserved in my judgment on that and how well it fits. And frankly, it's something that I'm trying to kind of jostle with in my head. But my initial instinct would just be to say that, live within your means, at least at the start. And the further along you can get with things you can afford, the better odds are that, in the long run, you're gonna be better off.
Yeah, I think that's something I noticed, especially with the fall of WeWork, right? With it's just like they had unlimited money to expand, but it's like, at what point are you actually making money? Like you have to turn it from a startup that's got so much potential to real money, right? Because the investors aren't putting money in there just for the hell of it. Like they want to get their return eventually. So I think that's interesting.
One point on that, Reid Hoffman actually did write a very interesting counter argument to why WeWork was never going to blitz scale well. If you like, I can share that with you as a follow up to this chat. But he made some very good arguments about how, WeWork wasn't exactly the perfect model of a business that could use network effects to scale. He talked about how some of the basic fundamentals of how WeWork was set up as a co-working organization didn't make it an ideal candidate for the blitz scaling method. And he's actually made some very good points there. And I would argue, I guess, to kind of defend my position on this same subject, that a lot of clean tech entrepreneurs, especially if you have a very kind of hardware focused technology, probably face the same issues as WeWork would. And so blitz scaling for a hardware heavy technology is just not, the best case. Now, are there lessons you can learn from that to accelerate your growth? Absolutely. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to attend that course. But it's not necessarily as much of a deal as, let's say if Clubhouse becomes the next Facebook, like you'd be able to tell if that's gonna yet again prove out the blitzscale theory. In all likelihood, it probably won't, because I think Facebook is already coming out with its own version of it. So we'll see how that goes.
We'll see. Interesting. So there's a couple things from your last answer that I wanted to maybe ask about. Is One of them would be, I think that probably the best thing to focus on now would be, what is the biggest product that you guys are producing right now, and that's being eaten up on the market with cut? Like, what is it doing, and what is it accomplishing for your clients?
So our major focus for the last couple of years has been an alternative for cement. So just to kind of start from the start, when you look at those cement trucks going out on the roads, with the spinning drums at the back, those are generally not just carrying cement, they're carrying concrete. And basically what concrete is a mix of cement, rock, sand, and gravel, and sometimes a few other chemicals that help it flow and set at the time that you want it to. So whenever you're doing a driveway or a sidewalk or a high rise, these trucks are essentially taking the material which has been pre-mixed at a facility over to the site where it's actually going to be cured. And cement in that mix of concrete is the only glue. And generally, that is the most carbon intensive part of the concrete mix. So a general cubic meter of concrete, like if you had 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter of concrete, that's the wet stuff. Pre or post curing, it kind of holds its volume, but only about, it weighs about 2.5 tons. So every cubic meter will weigh 2.3 to 2.5 tons, but only 200 to 300 kilos of that is going to be cement. So it's only about 10% of the weight, but over 90% of the carbon emissions of that cubic meter come from that 10%. So it's definitely kind of the Achilles heel to make concrete sustainable. And, apart from water, it's been shown with multiple studies that concrete is actually the most used man-made material in the world. So, we drink water and we essentially pour concrete. That's second on the list. And we produce over 6 billion tons of or cubic meters of concrete a year. So there's almost a cubic yard of concrete for every single person on the planet every year. And if you were to take just the construction companies, like the concrete companies, the Lafarges and others, those companies produce more emissions than any other country in the world except the US and China. They're the third largest emitter. They produce almost 10% of the global emissions. So as you can imagine, when you're talking about something that's that ubiquitous and being used at those volumes, for a company that's working in carbon use and carbon beneficiation, it becomes a pretty interesting target to consider. And that's really where we've been at. And not just us, there's a portfolio of companies kind of targeting this space. What we have found, though, is we've been leveraging some of the work that's already been happening in this space to make cement and concrete less carbon intensive. So what people have found, especially since the 60s, it was actually a professor at UC Berkeley back in the 1910s, like right after the First World War and before the Great Depression, he came up with this thing where he said, if you burn coal power, like if you burn coal at a coal power plant, you produce some ash. And he found that the ash that is left behind by burning coal is actually a really good cementitious material. So what he found was, if you've got a concrete mix that has 200 kilos of cement, you can actually take 20 or 30 kilos out and replace that with this fly ash from coal power plants and get to the same strength. In fact, in some cases, you'll get much better performance with your building material. And so these type of materials, there are a few of them. There are some natural materials that you can mine in the earth. There are some that are produced from steel smelters. And a lot of our focus has been on fly ash, although in the last year, we found about 10 other materials, of which 8 are natural, that can also serve the same purpose of substituting cement in a concrete mix. And what we've found, generally speaking, is that not only are you able to take that 90% carbon footprint of cement down to like 60 to 70%, so you're literally able to reduce the emissions of concrete, like the carbon emissions of concrete, by 10 to 20%. But you're also able to do that cost effectively because these materials that we're using as our feedstocks are actually very cheaply available. Usually, they're not high performing materials. And when they go through our process, they supercharge in performance. They not only absorb CO2 through our proprietary mineralization process, but they also become much more reactive. And they're able to give you much better performance so that, if, to give you a very concrete example, pun intended, let's say a mixed design in Alberta for a sidewalk, right? Let's say that has 250 to 300 kilos of cement, which is roughly right. They'll have about 250 kilos of cement in a cubic meter, and they'll have probably 50 to 60 kilos of fly ash. What we're finding is that we can cut that 250 kilos of cement down to 220 or even 200, leave the 60 kilos of fly ash, The only difference being that that has now been treated with our process, and now you're cutting your cement use in that mix by, you know, anywhere from 10 to 20%. And so that's the exciting kind of value proposition. Cement is not only the highest carbon footprint, it's also the most costly component of the mix. So you reduce the environmental footprint, you reduce the cost, and you're getting rid of a waste material that otherwise would just sit in a landfill. In fact, you know, there have been numerous studies that have shown just in the top 10 countries that used coal power in the 1900s, over 40 billion tons of fly ash was produced that's just sitting in landfills now. And so even if coal power was to disappear tomorrow, there's a strong argument to take those, you know, ash repositories and actually remediate them. And like I said, I think in areas like Africa, you know, parts of kind of the Middle East and North Africa region, where there never has been a lot of coal. Now, there are a lot of parts in South America where there's been a lot of gas and not a lot of coal. In those areas, you know, some of the minerals that we've been targeting, you know, we've shown that minerals like kaolin, pumice, like volcanic rocks, you can run them through our process as well and get the same type of performance as we get with fly ash. So that has been a really exciting development for us, because what that means is, you know, we no longer have to tie ourselves to fly ash. There's no linkage with coal. You know, whether a place ever burned coal or not, we're able to take presumably a locally available mineral, run it through our process, and do it energy efficiently so that it takes way less carbon than it would to process a ton of cement.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. Yeah, so there's no scarcity issue that you'd ever run into.
Yeah, or geographic kind of you know, limitations, because, you know, we don't have to be within 100 miles of a coal power plant that got shut down anymore. Like some of the minerals that we're looking at are some of the top 20 most abundant minerals on Earth. So they're ubiquitous around the world in any kind of geological formation. And so we don't really have to worry about, you know, how do we find the right fit there. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. Like that just gives us a lot more optionality. And we think that really, you know, with this entire push that the entire concrete industry has been having on reducing their emissions, they've been looking at supplementary cementitious materials anyway. They've been looking at ways to substitute cement out with something else that has a lower carbon footprint. And we're finding a way of taking any mineral they find. You know, that's kind of maybe a bit hyperbolic, because, you know, there might be some that won't work, but for a variety of ones that we have tested so far, we're showing that those minerals already perform well in concrete, but with our process, they perform even better. And so if you can sequester CO2, and if you can add that additional performance benefit, then that's kind of the win-win environmental economic argument that we're looking to push forward.
Got it. So what is, since you had to create this minimum viable product so far, what is next on the list? Like, I know it sounds like you guys are planning to scale at some point, or you've already done a bit in the past few months here, but what is next on the list, and where do you think you can have the next most impact?
Yeah, excellent question. So as you said, we actually have had a pretty interesting 12 months with regards to scale up. We've just been competing right now in the finals of the Carbon X Prize competition. It was sponsored by NRG, the energy company in the States, and COSIA, which is an oil and gas kind of innovation agency here up in Canada. And we're in the final stages of it. So there are going to be 2 winners here, announced probably sometime this summer in June or July. You know, hopefully we'll be one of the winners. But essentially, to even kind of put our name in the hat, we had to aggressively scale up what we're doing. So we commissioned in mid-November here a 20-ton-a-day system. So this is a big reactor. It's about 35 feet long, about 12 feet in diameter. And it sits here at a natural gas power plant in Calgary. And essentially what it's doing is it's taking flue gas, it's taking the carbon emissions from the flue gas from that power plant and converting it into the solid product that can replace cement. And so we've got a couple of local partners here that are working with us on the beneficiation piece, like actually putting it into their concrete. But what we're doing on site is making 20 tons a day, or 20 tons per batch, of this enhanced ash, which is sequestering CO2, about half a ton to 1 ton of CO2, and making it into this valuable product that can reduce carbon footprint by reducing cement. And so our intent with building that unit was twofold. One was, of course, to compete in the prize and show that, you know, we can capture CO2 at larger amounts, like industrially relevant amounts. But secondly, we saw it as a stepping stone to building a really commercial, like a first commercial facility, which would have to be about 5 to 10 times bigger than what we've got here. So if we're able to do 100 or 200 tons a day setup, that unit will do commercial amounts of product, and that'll significantly reduce the emissions of that facility, because you'll be using 10 to 15, maybe 20% less cement all across the board for whatever that ready mix concrete plant might be working on. So in terms of concrete, I would say that the path is fairly clear. Over the next 18 months, our intent is to nail down at least one project where we've got a commercial facility in the works with a partner on the ground. We've been exploring a few options both in North America as well as elsewhere, like in Europe and Southeast Asia. But from a more systemic perspective, because we have a platform technology and we can tweak the type of nanomaterial that we make with this CO2 absorption process, we've also been looking more closely on plastics and energy storage. Those are two areas where we're beginning to embark on a couple of research partnerships where we think we could actually have a minimum viable product within the next 8 to 12 months. One of my colleagues has been working on 3D printed plastics, for example, where we can have embedded carbon into the spool of resin you might buy. We've also been looking at biodegradable resins, where if you have a resin that degrades in the presence of sunlight or just in soil with water, it becomes CO2 or methane over a period of time, but it's not causing microplastic issues. Ideally, what we'd want is the carbon that we put in, like the carbon nanomaterial that we put in, kind of stays in the ground, fixes more carbon as char in the soil, and kind of creates this closed loop, kind of multifaceted proposition, each of which is kind of offering a benefit to the environment. So those things are kind of earlier stage. We realize that as slow moving as concrete and that construction sector is, at least it's kind of a simpler supply chain because there's a lot of vertical integration there. In the areas of plastics and energy storage, like batteries or ultracapacitors, there's a lot, like the OEMs, OEMs all the way out to the end user. There are multiple different suppliers that sit in that value chain. And so, creating a value proposition that kind of fits with all of them is very difficult. And it just takes time. It's not that it's not doable, but we're hopeful that we'll have at least a second line of products in that space, one of those two spaces, in the next year or two as well.
So do you see the future of this being that there's going to be separation between the companies that are creating the product, and then there's companies that are going to find the distributors? So it's kind of just broken down so that there is more, I guess you could say more members of the supply chain. That way you're not having to do all of it and integrate all of it into your process.
Very much so. I think generally speaking, if you look at any kind of new advanced technology that begins to get commercialized in a meaningful way, that stratification tends to happen with time. I think oil and gas, and to a certain extent concrete, are probably the two areas where there are still a lot of vertically integrated companies. But if you think about back in the 1800s, like when Standard Oil was going and Rockefeller was the richest man in the world, I mean, compared to that, oil and gas is not vertically integrated. It's just more vertically integrated than a lot of the new companies that we form in software and IT and that space. Historically, I think what has generally tended to happen is, as a sector has evolved, it has become more stratified and less integrated from a vertical standpoint. So I absolutely agree with you that I think that's probably, it'd be a good sign of success to see that happen, because that would suggest that more and more people are getting involved in this space. And I think with some of the the policy endeavors that we expect to see here in the U.S. After kind of the new election results, and also just overall, a lot of these kind of developed OECD countries looking at using the climate angle to re-stimulate the economy and put a lot of money back into the private sector. I think that there are some good ingredients here that are coming together to potentially make that happen. But yeah, I think overall, it still boils down to good execution, and I think a big challenge for a lot of the companies that are in this space now, or the ones that are going to enter, is do we have the caliber of founders and the founding teams such that they can actually execute and use these kind of different levers and all this kind of positive attention that's coming here in a way to actually execute, not just become kind of personally rich in some way, but actually make a systemic change where in 10, 20, 30 years from now, like people look back at the carbon tech industry and say, wow, like it's a no-brainer that was going to replace, the conventional oil and gas industry, for example, as a major employer of people and creating a lot of stability in the economy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So I guess I had not really understood anything about the clean tech sector until I had joined this, this new role with Next Wave, and I got to see kind of what is all going on. And to me, it seems as though there's just so much potential, right? It's almost like the Industrial Revolution level of potential, right? Everything can be changed. And so I guess what I'm curious about is, in your opinion, aside from what you guys are doing, what are some of the other major areas that you see a lot of potential for innovation, and how can people try to get ahead of that and try their best with limited existing resources and existing proven technology? How can they get into those spaces early?
Yeah, excellent question. I think apart from carbon capture and reuse, which again, notwithstanding the Elon Musk tweet, was still getting a lot of attention from policymakers around
Yeah.
the world. It obviously kind of takes a whole new level when he tweets about Dogecoin one day and carbon removal the next. It takes it another notch, I guess. But in all seriousness, I think that, to your point, there has been a concerted effort since the early 2000s. I would say even before Obama took office in his first term, but definitely during his fiscal response to that great recession back then, where he started providing these incentives for renewable energy deployment. I think that's still a wave. You don't hear about solar incentives and renewable energy incentives as much, because I think they've now entered the space where a lot of private equity firms are getting involved, and a lot of big major offshore wind farms are being talked about. This is no longer kind of the solar city model of put a solar panel on your roof and you make some money. It's become like the mainstay now for very large institutional players in finance. So I think, but that work still remains. I mean, there's a lot of work still that needs to happen around renewable energy in whatever sense. There's still, I guess, this hesitation within the public domain to look at nuclear, and that means that for renewable energy to kind of meet all of our transition demands over the next 30 or 40 years, the push that we've seen in the last 15 years needs to go on for at least another 30. So I would say that that's one space that, although it looks a bit, to the outside observer, it might look like it's slowing down a bit. I actually think that there's some serious potential there. And then the other one, which has been catching a lot of attention, and I'm not sure, where it stands on the Gartner hype cycle, because like I actually think that maybe, although it's got a very good future, I think that a lot of it is being overhyped, would be hydrogen. There's been a lot of focus now around green hydrogen and even blue hydrogen, and what type of infrastructure we need to be able to deploy so that hydrogen is not only produced cost effectively and in an environmentally friendly manner, but is actually being transported to make an economy where you can drive a hydrogen vehicle from New York to LA and all that stuff. And I don't think that that's necessarily not doable, but I do think that kind of an infrastructure revamp is going to take a lot of time. I mean, if electrification of the grid is anything to go by, there's no reason why that's going to happen on a time scale less than that. But again, there's a lot of potential there, because whether it be hydrogen storage, hydrogen production, or even some of the logistics and some of the kind of infrastructure related pieces where non-technical people can come up with some novel business ideas on how to monetize this. I think there's a lot of room to play with that. And I guess lastly, I would say, generally speaking, like the materials innovation space, if you look at solar cells, for example, we had an intern last year that kind of did a study on, when did solar cells start becoming a thing? And one of the things she found was, like some of the earliest patents on solar cells, and like finding that you can take light to create photons to then create DC power. These were produced back, before the Second World War. So why is it that, it took us so long to start building solar panels in our homes? And a lot of it boiled down to concerted policy efforts by the European governments, a major push that the Chinese government did. There was one professor at the University of New South Wales in Australia that's considered like the godfather of the solar industry. So, the Germans still about the 70s and 80s were making all the solar cells in the world, even into the 90s. And this professor and the Australian prof took in a whole bunch of Chinese students, for his graduate and postdoc work. And it turns out like 4 of the 5 largest solar cell manufacturers in the 2010s even in the late 2000s, like 2006 to 7, the CTOs for the four largest solar manufacturers in China were all graduates from his faculty in Australia. And one of the things that they did really well, which allowed China to become such a superpower in that space, was they went down and they essentially said the way the Germans and the Europeans are making these solar cells is always going to stay costly. These are the cost cutting measures we can take to bring the cents per kilowatt hour installed down. And they took a lot of incremental changes, and it ended up creating a massively disruptive effect. And to me, that story is kind of resonant on a couple of I guess levels. One, in that even with all the right policy frameworks and the right people and motivations, you still need someone to create an innovation framework where you can dive really deep into what the problem is and try to solve it fundamentally. And I think that was one of the things this professor's group was able to do really well. And then the graduates and then kind of started their solar companies were able to monetize. And I think that level of extremely deep skill, if applied to the material space in general, which is obviously a platform technology by definition, I think that can really help with the pace at which we're able to deploy the type of changes that we want to still have a realistic goal of hitting our goals for 2100.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, one thing, I guess, right along this train of thought here is you talked about the speed at which it took to get to this point where things are like solar is now cheaper to create than it is for conventional means. What are some of the ways, you also mentioned these prizes, what are some of the ways that you see that we could try to get the speed at which this new innovation comes to be faster? Because obviously by nature, government agencies are going to move slowly, right? They have accountability places, things to check them along the way, but yet we want this tech mindset of creating things really quickly and trying to figure out problems. So how can we make that faster? How can we just try to accelerate the entire process of coming up with these new technologies faster and deployable faster? Because we don't really have a lot of time before this all goes to hell,
Yeah, it's a question that frankly I've been giving a lot of thought to, but probably not enough, because I do agree with you. I think generally speaking, one thing I would say is that if you look at some of the examples of innovation frameworks that have worked well, whether it be Xerox Labs, Bell Labs, you look at some of the most innovative kind of periods in human history, even like you look at the Renaissance or the Chinese over a period of time, though I think you can argue that the Chinese culture kind of got complacent over a period of that because they were so ahead of everyone that there wasn't that competitive need that you had, in the 15 and 1600s in Europe, where all these city-states were competing with each other to come up with the best gunpowder and the best cannon and the best cartography skills so that they could, go out and colonize the world. So I think creating that competitive environment was actually, a huge reason for why kind of the world has played out since the 1600s to the way it has now. And I'm kind of an avid, if in like, not well-read kind of advocate of reading into history. Like I actually enjoy reading into history a lot and looking at what kind of parallels we can draw. But generally speaking, I think there are a few principles around, taking more shots on goal and creating a competitive, thriving market for things that society thinks are important that ultimately create the best results. And, I think that's one of the reasons why capitalism hasn't seen kind of, the fundamental competition in many areas, where even in countries that are considered socialist, like, Sweden or Norway, you would still have a very kind of thriving, innovative environment because there is still competition for limited resources, even in those areas. And so, generally speaking, I think in terms of what would be required to accelerate this advancement in this space, I think it boils down to two specific things that people can do top down. So policymakers or people that have got kind of the flex to make thematic changes at a municipal, provincial, or federal level. And I think one of them would be, really supporting fundamental work. So there needs to be kind of a portfolio where, fundamental science has to be given a bigger push. But I think that has to be done with the lens of how does that translate into something that the real world could use. So, it almost needs to be a portfolio-based approach where there are some folks that are allowed to do their theoretical work and they can work with, characterization and analysis of materials they find all day long. But there has to be a similar portfolio for folks that are working on that fundamental stuff, but saying, if we change this fundamentally here, this is why it would be important for making a biodegradable, highly durable plastic that's going to make space travel possible at half the weight that we currently do. And, that second piece, in my opinion, is not being given the credence that it needs to. So the people that are able to do that, and if it's not a certain individual, they need to be paired with people that see the bigger picture. And I think that's not necessarily being done. There is some talk about, the new Biden administration maybe doing an ARPA-C, coming up with a version of DARPA that's very much focused on carbon, the C standing for carbon in that name. I think that would be a very, very exciting place to be, because the DARPA work, it obviously kind of spun out from the work that Vannevar Bush did back during the First World War. It created an excellent framework where America currently, you look at the internet, you look at microwaves, you look at some of the most ubiquitous cell phone technologies in the world. All of those came out of projects that were funded by DARPA or its predecessor in some way. And so creating a version of that, not just in America, because America should not have monopoly on all the best ideas. They shouldn't have the monopoly on, this innovation framework. In fact, I've been trying, in whatever kind of influence I have, to start talking to some Canadian stakeholders about repeating that kind of a framework here. And, I'm originally from India, and I think there are over 1 billion people back home that could be filtered into a network like this, where they could start looking at a system where, if they have an idea or if they have an interest to get involved in a certain field, that they actually have a roadmap to follow. And I think, creating that process framework without kind of being biased to a certain result is probably the thing that's missing at a systemic level. And if we can kind of have, if ARPA-C does come through, like, the ideal case from my perspective would be to have an ARPA for clean tech that is just spun out in every single country in the world. And really, from a fiscal standpoint, it should be a no-brainer, because it's going to create some high-paying jobs. It's going to employ people of skill, not just technical scientists and engineers and stuff, but even tradesmen, right? Like, there's going to be a lot of trades involved in that kind of work. And it'll create circulation of capital. It'll incentivize people to start looking at the environment, because that's ultimately what's driving this work. And so I think it could become a pretty interesting flywheel that people can try. But ultimately, I think, as happens in everything, we need more case studies so that people don't feel like they're the first people jumping in. And hopefully that happens soon enough. We'll see.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's interesting. One thing I'm curious, do you know of any programs or maybe some universities that are working on trying to pair the scientific type of research, people who are doing research, with figuring out, okay, this is a new technology, with somebody on the business side of things who's like, okay, but can we make this viable? Can we make this into a product? Because obviously this is what you had to do with carbon upcycling. So do you know of any things out there, or is that something you see anybody working on?
Yeah, no one that I would say that overall there's a lot of that intent. I think of Creative Destruction Labs. I think of ARPA-E, right? The energy focused work that they do, and they're very much trying to do exactly that, where they try to find a young entrepreneur. Sometimes it's a graduate from the research group that has come up with the core technology, and they try to train them. The NSF I-Course program in the States is kind of trying to do the same thing. But generally speaking, I think it ends up becoming a little kind of preordained, in the sense that the professor that comes up with the technology isn't going out and posting a job saying, I've come up with the next best transistor, help me commercialize this. He's not going out. He doesn't have an HR department. He or she won't have an HR department to figure out, where do they find the best individual to run this thing, who might be the ex, CTO of AT&T, and she might be the best candidate, but she lives in Atlanta, and this prof in Boston can't figure out a way to get to her, because, his first instinct is to look at his research group and say, who's, out of the 10 or 15 students that I employ, who's the most likely to go out and make a pitch and make it work. And I think, within that, there are a couple of, I think, counterproductive kind of systemic measures that we go for. People that pitch the best tend to get put into that position. They're not necessarily the best people to grow a business. And in some cases, the familiarity bias, right? That prof should be looking at options everywhere. And I don't necessarily think, to be honest with you, and I'm not speaking here from a very educated position. Like, I haven't done an extensive kind of research project or put an intern on it yet to really answer your question with a very high degree of confidence. But I would say that generally speaking, I have not seen many instances, at least in the carbon tech and kind of associated clean tech space, of a researcher being paired up with a commercializer or an entrepreneur with very objective criteria in mind. Like that almost very rarely happens, I think. And I honestly
Yeah.
can't think of a single example where that has happened in a very objective way without any kind of bias.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, very good. Well, that's been a great conversation here so far. I know I want to be conscious of your time, but I guess one last thing I'd like to ask maybe for anybody listening is, especially for people who are trying to innovate, and there's going to be a lot of obstacles to overcome, and you've made quite a success of your short period of time in this. What would you offer as advice or maybe motivation to those people who are going to constantly run into these roadblocks? What would you say to them to help them keep going, to keep pushing?
Yeah, I'll share kind of a tidbit here with you. So there is a very interesting book um, by Anton Howes about the Society of Arts in the UK, which was initially developed in the mid 1700s, but it's one of the oldest organizations around now, promoting science and arts at a very kind of public level. So it's not one of those top down organizations. It's a bottom up grassroots organization. And I've had the pleasure of kind of speaking with Anton about almost exactly the question that you asked. Because what I've been curious about is, as a historian who's read about the Industrial Revolution and about how innovations happen since Eisenbart Brunel all the way out to, Bill Gates and the folks that we know today, Elon Musk and others. The question I asked is like, what are the frameworks of innovation that allowed the UK, which to be honest was not a colonial superpower right at the start? How did they leapfrog over Spain and Portugal that were way ahead, like 30 years ahead at that time, to then become, the most significant industrial power for till the early 1900s? And one of the things he talks about there, from a fundamental standpoint, which I think gets to the root of how I would answer your question, is he talks about how invention tends to be this thing that people don't really think about unless they're exposed to it. And so my question to him was, if you're a Canadian policymaker or, some kind of a policy person or even a young grad, and you're trying to figure out like, what are the things I need to do to make Alberta more innovative, or Boston, or whatever kind of city or province you take. And, we always think about it from a top down perspective. Like, what can we do? Can we bring a group of people together? Right. And we start innovating and we nerd out and we think about ideas. You get like-minded people together and they think about things. Or you put hackathons together, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And Anton actually just had a newsletter where he answered this question very well. And he said that one of the biggest predetermining factors of whether someone is going to innovate is whether they have had a previous exposure, some kind of meaningful exposure to an innovator that has made it before. And the point that he tries to stress is that in the UK, in the Midlands in particular, because they were much smaller towns, it's actually interesting because there's also a similar study saying that some of the best football players in the States come from towns that are less than 500,000 people. And some of the best basketball players come from towns that have less than 500,000 people. And I'm not really sure if these are correlated or not. But the point that he makes about innovation is that the pool is big enough that there is genuine competition, but it's small enough that everyone knows each other. And so they're able to work together. And, if someone comes up with a new technology and it works and they're able to make a success story out of it, they're able to then connect with these other people that are interested in that space. And they get a flavor or kind of this mental map of how this can be translated and how they can do that themselves for whatever situation they put themselves in. And so I would say that for most people like trying to enter this space, I think, overall, a lot of people talk about challenges around financing and the timelines. You can't be an overnight success here the way you can with software. And, frankly, I don't necessarily think that, a lot of the companies we think about as overnight successes, even in the software space, were overnight successes. But especially in clean tech, there is a lot of, I guess, inertia or I guess, aversion to taking that jump into the space right from the onset, because it stares you right in the face that you've got to build heavy equipment, got to get these major players on board. And I think a more inspiring and motivational message would be to say, let's find other people that have done it. Let's look at, how we break this down into kind of smaller baby steps that you can take to move this along. And generally, I think, going back to something I talked about earlier, I think staying power has a lot to do with it. Jim Collins talks about this in a couple of his podcasts and in one of his books as well. Like he talks about how one of the main things about, the flywheel effect is whatever flywheel does take off, because you're going to try 10 of them and many of them aren't going to run.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that does, you got to make sure that it has enough staying power to keep you alive till the next one takes off. And I think as a startup founder or as a person getting involved in this space, you just have to be cognizant of the fact that, a lot of your reputation is going to be built over time. And a lot of kind of your track record isn't going to yield results right off the bat either. And so if you can make sure that you're kind of, showing staying power with whatever strategy you choose, whether it's raising a lot of money or bootstrapping, just make sure that you're around and playing a 5-year or 10-year game. Because, there is that saying, you overestimate what you can do in a year and you grossly underestimate what you can do in 10. And I think that would be probably the most important thing, is to keep that in mind and find an innovator that has been able to do it, because that'll put you in good stead.
For sure. Well, I think that's I appreciate that advice. That's good stuff. So awesome. Well, thank you again so much for taking the time to chat today. It was really enjoyable, and we'll have to do it again in the future. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys can accomplish.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Silas. It was great to chat with you as well. And yeah, happy to stay in touch.
For sure. Awesome. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining me on today's episode with Apoorv Sinha. It was such a great conversation, as I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did creating it. Please do, if you enjoyed this, comment what was your biggest takeaway. What are some of the major questions you still have? I'd love to try to answer those for you in the future, either through another conversation with Apoorv or potentially with another guest. Please do share this as well with somebody who's interesting. I think, especially as he talked about the innovation at the end there with the exposure that people have to have. I think that what he's talking about here could be that exposure for somebody else in the future. So please do share with somebody who you think has an interest in these things, maybe an entrepreneur who's looking for a problem to solve, and comment again your thoughts. What did your takeaway? What are your biggest questions? Any guests you'd like to see in the future? And as always, please do subscribe for more content. And if you'd like to be involved, please also join the Slack channel, as you may be able to meet some interesting people through there and to try to help get involved in this clean tech revolution that we are going into, and all of the really exciting things that we're going to be seeing here in the future. So again, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Also, next time we actually will be speaking with Madison Savalo of Carbon Upcycling as well, but she's working on their new venture, Expedition Air. So stay tuned for that episode coming in the near future. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.